So you've watched all the videos about yes-anding, helping others be awesome, how to do character voices, and you still don't feel like you really know how to roleplay. Well, learning different improv and acting techniques can absolutely be helpful. These skills mean pretty much nothing if you haven't already learned how to roleplay like a nerd. Hey guys, Stephanie here. Today I wanted to talk about how to roleplay. I wanted to make a video especially for those who don't really feel like they know what they're doing. I think people have a tendency to view... They're coming. There's a wasp trying to get into my house. Anyways, I think people have a tendency to view roleplay as this kind of like vibe-based, in-the-moment type of thing that you can't really plan for, and they're wrong. So I'm going to show you guys how to roleplay like a nerd. You're going to learn how to study the choices you make during character creation, and then turn those things into a list of roleplay inspiration and ideas that you can actually use in character in your games. Chances are you already have some idea about who your character is. You probably already have some backstory, their class, subclass, and their traits, bonds, ideals, flaws picked out. And if you don't feel like you already have a super compelling backstory, I've plugged it before and I'll plug it again. Elise Rosenda's Session 0 is a really great tool for developing your character's backstory. But what we're going to try and do right now is look at our character's backstory with fresh eyes. That way we can mine our character's story for roleplay ideas. And I'm going to use a character I created recently for a Curse of Strahd game, Verity Verdante, as an example and go through the ABCs of her story. So we'll start with her ancestry, go through her background, and talk about her class and the roleplay implications of these three things coming together. So first things first, she's an Asmar. How would that affect how she appears in the world? Verity grew up in a convent near a small village, so I think that the people near her would think of her as kind of a miracle sent to them. In fact, that's the nickname her adoptive parents gave to her, Little Miracle. And with just this tiny bit of information, I already have several ideas of how this story could be translated into roleplay at the table. I think that since her world is so small and insular, Verity would be pretty naive about the broader world and how it works. But I also think she'd have like a lot of overconfidence because she's always had a lot of support and a lot of the people around her truly believe in her and her abilities. And then the dark side of that particular coin could be that she's really hard on herself, or she can be an intense people pleaser because she doesn't want to let anybody down. And I want to take a moment to remind you to look at both the positive and negative traits. This is how we make a character, not a caricature. I also think based on the fact that she's an Asmar and grew up in a convent, Verity would probably be a paladin or a cleric. So I decided on making her a grave cleric tied to Kelmvor. 1, because this is a very useful subclass in Curse of Strahd, and 2, because I thought this would make her character a lot more interesting. Verity could have easily veered into kind of that generic fantasy healer type of category if I'd gone with something like light or life cleric. And not that that's a bad thing, but I personally know I have a lot more fun if I make certain parts of my characters unexpected. And since grave clerics usually look and seem a little bit more edgy, I knew I kind of wanted to play into the opposite of that trope. So this choice made me realize that Verity was probably very bubbly and optimistic, which also happens to fit really well with the idea of her being naive and people-pleasy. But I want to take that bubblegum girl persona and combine it with a very competitive drive. And I was scrolling through a wiki on Kelmvor when I found a section that mentioned that the best of his followers are usually skilled in combat and go out adventuring to make sure that dead things stay dead and alive things don't go meet the gods prematurely. So I think that her being a kind of goody two-shoes overachiever would naturally lead to her wanting to be one of Kelmvor's best. So this is a great call to adventure and bond for her to have. She wants to serve her god in the highest capacity, and that means getting out there and kicking some undead butt. But how prepared for this will she truly be since she's spent her whole life in this little convent? And at this point, I just start going through the other backstory choices and seeing what kind of flavor they might add to this character. Verity naturally has an acolyte background, so I wanted to think more about what her life in the convent would have looked like. Like I mentioned before, I think she would have been a bit of a goody two-shoes since I imagine her as that classic childhood overachiever. But I also imagine her as intensely curious. So I think there would be some stories about her being tempted by the rebellious tendencies of other young acolytes. Or maybe those in charge over-relied on her abilities, or kind of paraded her around without her really understanding what was happening. An easy flaw to give her is to make her absolutely too trusting of others. And I just kind of keep doing this process, going through the descriptions for different choices that I made, and keep mining this story that I've already created for traits that would be associated with this character. If I get stuck or feel uninspired, another thing I like to do is think about different characters from books, TV shows, movies, video games that might be similar to my character in certain ways. And then I choose 2 or 3 of those to mine for inspiration. So for Verity, I think characters that would have kind of a similar vibe to her would be Rapunzel from Tangled, Star Butterfly from Star vs. the Forces of Evil, and Charlie from Has-Been Hotel. Even though that last one's a little bit ironic for an ASMR. But I'll take those characters and then go to a website like tvtropes.com and start going through kind of ideas that are on those pages. And I'll look out for ones that stand out to me in different ways. Ones that I'll either take as is, like friend to all living things. Verity has no reason to think any people or creatures are bad because she hasn't been taught that. Or ones that I can subvert, like apologetic attacker. Even though Verity is really sweet, she loves fighting the undead and the righteous feeling it gives her. So now in this next step, we're going to take those ideas for personality traits that we've already mined and we're going to ask ourselves, what traits were caused by things that this character went through, and what traits caused things to happen to them? To put it in simpler terms, which traits are truly immutable traits? A trait they've developed in response to something that happened to them? Something like not trusting people after they were abandoned? That, with work, can change. It's a trait that's plastic, but a trait that routinely causes things to happen to them? That's probably a core part of who they are. So why does thinking about our character traits in this way matter? Because this is how you start to think about your character's pattern of actions and reactions. This is how you start to think about your roleplay formulas. So fun fact, I'm a certified matchmaker. Yeah, like that kind of matchmaker. I promise this is relevant. I'm a big fan of Helen Fisher's work. She created the personality tests for a little company called Match.com based on the science of certain personality traits tied to our brain systems. There are 4 broad types of temperament categories that are linked to our dopamine system, our serotonin system, our testosterone system, and our estrogen system. And yes, both men and women have testosterone and estrogen systems. If you don't believe me, go ask your high school health teacher. And so I use this framework to start thinking about how my character broadly operates in the world. What are their core traits? As opposed to the little sprinkles of personality flavor that can be added and changed over time. And I recommend actually going and taking her assessment as your character. I'll link to it in the description below. But go through the test and pay attention to not only the results, but also which particular questions in each group your character resonates with strongly or has outlier answers to. Verity is an explorer/dopamine-linked personality. She craves fresh and fun experiences. She's very optimistic and energetic, but she doesn't actually get that bored with routines and kind of the daily grind. She's much more likely to find a way to turn all of that into a fun game and entertain those around her. Verity is also pretty high in builder/serotonin-linked personality traits as well. But here's where you start to see some weird outlier answers. The things that she resonates with in this category have a lot to do with respecting authority, like in her convent, believing in upholding moral values, honoring customs, and caring about being able to trust people. She actually scores really low in things like being meticulous, completing things in a straightforward way, and being cautious in her decisions. Which makes a lot of sense since she's dopamine dominant, serotonin secondary. So with this framework, we can identify these major immutable traits. And now we have something we can fall back on whenever we're not really sure how we would respond in a situation as our character. we know that Verity is probably going to choose fun first, unless, of course, something triggers those serotonin-based instincts. But what are the practical implications of all of this? How does knowing any of this help you actually roleplay? Now it's time to turn those notes you've taken into an actionable plan so you know how to respond in character to any situation that pops up at your table. The first thing I do is list out how my character will respond to broad situations. You can see here I use kind of a wheel and spokes type chart to jot down general ideas about behaviors and what they look like. But for this section, I usually use more of a flow chart. And these are both just kind of for organizing my thoughts or to check in with before a session. I usually don't need them at the table. And so broad situations are things like unexpected detours and hardships, requests for help, adventure opportunities that come with high risk, dealing with personal connections to other PCs and NPCs, things like that. With Verity, I know one of her defining traits is optimism. So setbacks won't often rattle her, and if they do, it won't be for long. She has strong moral values from being raised at the convent, and she's intensely curious. So she's ready to say yes to helping pretty much any NPC, no matter how risky. And I feel like these are very much the types of characters that DMs create. I will say yes to all of your plot hooks. But when it comes to personal connections, she's gonna be so awkward. She can be charming in like surface level interactions, especially with any NPC that might be fascinated by her, but not really for anything deeper. She's used to people needing her, not the other way around. And she's definitely going to crave connection, but she's gonna have this almost fear of intimacy. She won't know what to do with it or with people seeking it. So I think that anytime things get emotionally serious, she's gonna try to awkwardly, lightheartedly break that tension. I also think about the traits I identified in the first two steps and how I can kind of get those across. For naivete, I can make her a literalist. I can make her someone who believes everything she's told. Someone who sees the good in everyone and everything. Overconfidence. She might be someone who rushes into situations before plans are fully formed. Someone more action-oriented. I'd also think through what happens when she learns she's not always capable of fixing problems, because she believes deeply in herself and the people around her. People pleaser. She's probably someone who hates letting other PCs and NPCs down. She doesn't like to be direct with any negative news. She dances around hard topics and can be easily guilted into doing things. High achiever. She might not be someone who knows when she's hit her limit and can kind of put the group into hairy situations. She can be competitive. Maybe she's even a little bit of a sourpuss if things don't end up going her way. But she probably doesn't stay that way for long since she is pretty upbeat. She also might tend to brag about her accomplishments and always strives to make herself better. Next, I look at a character's ability scores and skills. What does it look like when this character tries to intimidate someone? But also, what does it look like when someone tries to intimidate them? So I kind of go through the list and think about how these things connect and can flavor actions. Is this character good at acrobatics and performance? Make them a show-off who tries to impress people to make connections. What if they're good at animal handling and investigation? Ask your DM if your Forest Gnome Ranger can flavor their investigation as little mice kind of whispering secrets about things that they were missing when they were poking around the dungeon. For Verity, her strengths are insight, medicine, perception, and persuasion. Her major weaknesses are strength and athletics-based skills. If a situation involves an injured person, she gets to play the little angel healer, and she might be able to use that to finesse a little bit more information about somebody that she's helping. Since she's a cleric, it also makes sense for her insight and perception to be flavored as heavenly whispers steering her in the right direction. So go through and think about the flavor of each action to get an idea of what they might look like, even if it is something they might be bad at. If Verity tries to intimidate someone, I might say that I try to summon celestial light, make my voice deepen with some reverb, as I say, "Give me the icon," or else. But if she fails, all the NPC might see is this little blonde cream puff cleric puffing out her chest. If she succeeds at an athletics check with her -2 modifier, it might be flavored as her having a surge in power as her radiant soul energy expands and her action is imbued with Kelmvor's favor. If she fails, we might take note that this 6'2" Aasimar is all limbs and often stumbles about like a baby foal. But going through and thinking about different ways a character might try to sneak, persuade, perform, intimidate, and how you would flavor those successes and failures, that'll give you a great working idea of how to play your character at the table. And speaking of flavor, when I plan out my character, I think about different ways to sprinkle a little bit of flavor into their interactions. An easy way to do this is to give your character sayings and anecdotes that they can draw upon. For sayings, a really great resource is the Liars for Hire Instagram account. I used a combination of different sayings from them, as well as Southern and religious sayings, as a jumping off point for Aasimar sayings for Verity to kind of pull out. And recently the other players at my table fucking lost it when I said that a certain morally questionable NPC was several feathers short of a flock. I think sayings can be a really easy way to occasionally pepper in some personality and to really have fun with highlighting the differences between the different cultures that your characters grew up in. The same thing goes for having anecdotes. This reminds other players that you started as a person with their own history. You didn't just materialize out of thin air. For Verity, sometimes I'll preface stories with things like, "This one time at the convent," and "Mother Superior always said," and don't be afraid to write these ones out. It's okay to have notes. But after a few sessions of playing your character, you can usually start pulling some of these out of thin air. But probably the most important nerdy roleplay tip that I can give you is study the other characters. This is a group game. A lot of roleplay is very much about how you relate to and interact with the rest of your party. So what are the other characters' traits? What are their stories? What are their ABCs? Ask the other players about their characters. Ask about the things that are important to them, things that grate on their nerves, etc., etc. And trust me, you won't be annoying them. Everybody wants to talk about their character and rarely gets the chance to. In my campaign, one character recently had a lot of their life upended. They're unsure of themselves and their capabilities. Since Verity's overconfidence extends to people in her group, she's gonna spend a lot of time trying to build that character up. Another character started as hired assistants and has more of a prankster-oriented personality. So I know Verity is gonna find herself the butt of a lot of jokes, since like I said, she's very over-trusting. Will this end up hurting her feelings? Or will this other character start to feel bad because of how naive and overly trusting she is? Will he end up starting to treat her more kindly over time? But my favorite one was actually a surprise character, where the player didn't really want to reveal any concrete things to me before they were introduced a couple sessions into the game. And that's because they were a necromancer. Since I'm playing a grave cleric that believes that dead things should stay in the ground, this is a particularly hilarious juxtaposition for our party to have. So after they were introduced, I definitely spent some time outlining how Verity would dance around these uncomfortable topics to keep the peace. We talked about how we would navigate situations where I might want to kill something that this other player wants to keep reanimated. And it was genuinely so much fun. Side note, having a party with this complicated type of relationship isn't for everybody. So make sure your DM knows how you feel about having that kind of intra-party tension between you and another player. The other players in this particular game are all also people who DM, and we're all pretty experienced and have good communication skills. So going through and finding and planning for roleplay opportunities between you and the rest of your party can really help you find that seamless flow state that most players are really looking for when they play tabletop roleplay games. Now that you know how to roleplay like a nerd, all of those improv and actor-related tips will be so much more helpful, because now you'll understand how your character can yes and or make others look good. And if you enjoyed this video, Make sure to like and subscribe for more tips. And if you liked Verity and think that you might want to play a kick-ass Asmar, go watch this video next.